So welcome to this fourth and final session of Four Paths to Awaken a Kind Heart. And again, in the previous three, we went through the first three immeasurables: immeasurable equanimity, immeasurable love, and then immeasurable compassion. So were there any questions on anything we've covered, or especially on at the tail end of the last class, I went into those near enemies of compassion, and I don't know if there was any discussion that needed to happen on any of those, but anyone?
When you,
Yes.
this is Heather. When you were talking about, sorry, Jackie, go ahead. Or not. When you were talking about the near enemies of compassion, I really relate to that. I do a lot of race consciousness work in my consulting business, and it's a real pervasive thing for the way people interact with that content is to come from a place of what feels like, compassion, but it can be actually sort of condescending or sort of those poor people. And in my own sort of journey to have the, people be kind teachers and telling me that that's not
Right.
helpful. So that is what it made me think of. So
Oh,
thank you
good.
for bringing that up.
Good. Yeah, so I would say again, the antidote to that pity, that condescending sense of something approximating compassion, but not really compassion, would be to have some level of equanimity with regard to oneself, to recognize that you're in the same predicament as others. And of course, I think I mentioned this the other day. We have in the Christian tradition, I grew up with that idea of there but for the grace of God go I, but in Buddhism it's there but for the grace of karma go I. you know if it wasn't for certain things, I would be exactly the same in that predicament. And so, we are able to sort of take it out of that place of what our status is now, what other people, where they're at now, and just recognize that we're all in the same boat. And so any work on self-compassion, all of that would be an important part of developing kind of the antidote to that pity. In regard to the overwhelm, again, I kind of alluded to it, but it was the idea of seeing that it's not hopeless, that, we do have, even in the midst of the most challenging things within this human existence, you still can kind of put your faith and confidence in the fact that it can be different over time. May not be able to be different in the moment. We can't really change a lot of the things that have already come into play in terms of karma, but we can always use what we're experiencing as a vehicle, a method for, developing deeper realizations and awareness. And so in that way, it's always workable. Yeah. Everything we experience is workable to some degree. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Heather. It's good to see, that you're seeing some parallels in the work that you do, because I think it is important. People, there's a lot of increased awareness that's already happened around a lot of things in the world, but there always needs to be more, obviously. Jack, you were going to say something? No? You're okay?
Right. Yeah, I'm going to skip it right now. Thank you, though.
All right. Okay. If something else comes up, just raise your hand. You can raise your hand in Zoom too. There's a little thing for doing that. But anyway, anyone else? Anything from today that you want to explore any further, or have any questions about, comments about? I really do find this whole thing of the near enemies to be quite useful, because they do indicate to us when we're sort of just missing the mark a bit, perhaps. We might have some of the thoughts behind it, but they go askew. They don't really hit what we're aiming to achieve. So let's go ahead and take a look then. Let me pull up on the screen the handout that we've been working with for this. Get it back to this here. Oops, I can read it from here. I had it in the slides as well in the PowerPoint. Initially, I was thinking about putting everything in the PowerPoint, and I said, boy, that really seems silly. So I just put the quotes in PowerPoint, but they don't really even need to be there. For immeasurable joy, Kathleen MacDonald says, taking delight in the happiness, success, and good fortune of others is one of the ways that we practice of course, in her presentation, it was the third because she was going by the traditional way where equanimity was last. For us, it's the fourth, this fourth immeasurable thought, immeasurable joy. Immeasurable joy is often called sympathetic joy because it is not a private joy, such as we might feel from winning a tennis game. Rather, it is a joy that is outer directed and inclusive of others. Immeasurable joy is like a further extension of immeasurable loving kindness because it wishes everyone to experience happiness, not only now, but far into the future. And this is where when we have the prayer for immeasurable joy, which is on the screen now, the top of the page there, how wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were never separated from the happiness of higher rebirth and liberation. Sometimes it's worded differently in different prayers. Sometimes it says, we're in the state of happiness, free from suffering. But essentially the idea is that we want to think about the best for sentient beings. And then we want to share in that, kind of like, again, have that sympathetic joy. We're feeling with them and together with them in that joyous experience. So it's a little bit different, than what we might normally call joy, as she's pointing out. This is a sort of expanding our joy. And it's kind of interesting. Pema Chodron's well, actually, I don't know if it's hers, but the translation that she uses in her commentary on the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Shantideva's text, she has a translation for one verse in there that is a little bit different than some of the other translations. It's for chapter 5, verse 77. She says, "The goal of every act is happiness itself, though even with great wealth it's rarely found. So take pleasure in the excellence of others. Let them be a heartfelt joy to you." And the idea behind that, when it's worded that way, is that, if we look at it and we say, well, yeah, I mean, the happiness does come in various forms, always very fleeting and transitory. But if we really are bereft of happiness and at any point want to cultivate a happy, joyous mind, all we need to do is think about the good fortune of others. Of course, we can think about the good fortune of ourselves. Rejoicing in ourselves is also a recommended practice in the Buddhist path. But we always have something we could rejoice in, always have something that we could look at and say, oh, I'm so happy for their good fortune, for them to have what they have in their life. And then we can cultivate the joy that shares in the positive experiences that others are having or their positive qualities. So this whole topic of joy, again, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, while certainly the Four Immeasurables are taught and there it's presented, it tends to take root mostly in the limb of rejoicing, which is of the 7-limb prayer. It's the fourth limb, I believe, third limb, fourth limb. Yeah, because you have a prostration, offering, and then confessing and rejoicing. And so it's kind of, again, a practice where we look at ourselves and rejoice in our own good qualities, our own good fortune, the things that we do with our lives, the fact that we spent, a summer weekend together here going through these teachings and what have you. I mean, all these various things we can take great joy in. But we don't want to stop there with just ourselves. We want to rejoice in others. So we can rejoice in the other people who have taken their weekend to be here. We've also, got plenty of things we can rejoice in our world. Can rejoice in all those frontline workers that I mentioned earlier, that caregivers that are really, putting their lives on the line and doing so much to care for others in their distress and suffering. And we can rejoice in so many things. Again, all the great teachers that we've had and their great qualities. We can rejoice in the people that come to our Dharma centers and the various things that they do and so on. I mean, there's no shortage of things to rejoice in. So it's a very wonderful practice to engage in. I actually encourage everybody to do some form of a rejoicing practice at the end of each day. Normally, you're recommended to kind of do your purification, which was the third of the 7 limbs, the confessing of one's downfalls and developing a counterforce to that through the 4 opponent powers. And it's good to also rejoice at that time, maybe after one sort of cleaned up one's mess for the day through the purification practice, to then pause for a few minutes and rejoice in all the good things that you did that day, rejoice in others that you know of, others that you can imagine what they were doing. rejoice in whatever His Holiness the Dalai Lama is doing every day. He's not like binging on Netflix and doing things that are, not so necessarily that good. He's spending his time being of service to others, doing things to benefit others. And so same for Rinpoche, same for so many other people that we can rejoice in. So this is, again, a really important practice. Let's go through what is all on that handout and kind of go through that. I don't know that I need to say a whole lot more about rejoicing, and other than just getting into the instruction for it. So as I was just mentioning, we have a practice where we cultivate joy in one's own goodness. And again, I think there's nothing wrong with this. This is really, you're encouraged to do that. Part of the rationale for doing that is that it gives you the impetus to continue doing good. If you rejoice in it, it's sort of like, when your parents, when you were quite young, and they would, congratulate you on something good that you've done, or really commend you on a project you prepared for school or something. You get a positive strokes from that, in a sense, and you feel good about what you're doing because others have rejoiced in it. Well, you can rejoice in yourself, your own goodness. So as it says there, first, consider how you are the same as all beings and deserving to be happy both temporally and ultimately, as well as having the potential to know those states of well-being. Again, this is just a reminder all the time that this is the basis for all of these meditations. And here in this context, because we're going to talk about taking ourselves through temporal happiness and the causes of that, as well as a deeper state of well-being, we have to remind ourselves that that is completely possible for us. We might feel kind of stuck where we are right now, but that's not the case. We actually have great potential. Then we generate an attitude of joy in our own goodness through the following steps. First, recall your own good actions and qualities, those that have been beneficial to others, to you, or to both. A lot of our actions we do actually benefit both ourselves and others, whenever we're engaging in, you know, practices with bodhicitta and what have you. But a lot of times we just do simply things that help others at the time, do things that help ourselves through our own dedication to the meditations and practices and what have you on the Buddhist path. And I mean, just, our everyday kind of goodness to others, kindness to others. With each of these positive qualities or virtuous actions that you recall, think that it is good that you did these things, that you're glad you did them, and that you would gladly do them again. This is part of that reinforcement, that rejoicing helps us to get. It's the commendation of ourselves for having done what we've done, and recognizing that it's really good that we did this. There are certainly many people in the world who don't do such good things with their life, and it's quite unfortunate. But, we can be rejoicing that we're in a situation where we actually have learned to adopt good behaviors through the kindness of our teachers and our parents and so on, all the people who've been involved in that. And we can be very joyful that this is the situation we find ourselves in, and that we want to continue doing this. Why? Because we see that this is the cause for goodness in the world, for both ourselves and for others. Then we have the third step into rejoicing in as many actions and qualities as you can remember, generating a more and more expansive feeling of joy in your heart. And this is the thing about rejoicing, is rejoicing isn't just thinking about those things. Like I can say, I can think about I did this today, and I did that today, and I did this today. It's really generating joy in your heart, because you see that how wonderful that, again, through the force of a variety of causes and conditions, the kindness of so many others in our lives, we've come to a place where we do good things with our lives. Through the influences of all of those, we dedicate ourselves, to doing Buddhist practice, to helping others in the variety of ways that we do, and so on. So it's a really uh, kind of a deeper emotional experience than just thinking about these things. It's really to bring up this wellspring of joy, to kind of tap into that attitude that we can bring to our lives and to how we go about doing things. And as I said, it becomes reinforcing, and it actually feeds into then our desire to continue doing those things. Yeah. And it's nice, certainly, if we get accolades from other people. If a teacher, or a guru tells us, "So it's really good that you're doing all this." It's nice to hear that, but we can do that for ourselves. We don't have to wait for other people to commend us on our qualities or our activities. We can do that every day. And it's not, selfish and conceited to do that. We're not talking about inflating our pride so that we think we're, you know, the greatest thing on the planet in terms of our practice and our qualities. That's not what we're trying to do here. The motivation is to instill in you a sort of joyous attitude that can be the impetus for your going about continuing to do the work. Yeah. The fourth of the six perfections in the Bodhisattva path is joyous effort, joyous enthusiasm. I mentioned it this morning when I was talking about how Venerable Rabina was giving me the advice about not going down that slippery slope and making sure that I did, that particular power of relinquishment, of letting the task go in a very skillful way so that I wasn't actually, letting everything go, but rather just keeping that motivation. So, it's obviously an important part of our path. And what's interesting is the six perfections, they say, are set out in terms of difficulty of practice. So the first three are generosity, which is said to be the easiest to practice. And we can practice some very simple forms of generosity that don't involve too much, strain on our wallet or anything. We can begin wherever we are and just start practicing giving, giving, giving in a variety of ways, material things, giving support, protection, whatever. And then we get to morality, which is said to be a little bit harder to practice, but obviously it's an important part of our path. It's even taught, prior to the Bodhisattva path as an important component because our morality is what creates our karma and thereby our experiences in samsara, or outside of samsara for that matter. And then the third is patience, and patience is huge. I mean, that's a really tough one to practice, right? To be able to be undisturbed in the face of anything that flies at us, whether it be harm to us or just the day-to-day sufferings and difficulties, to be able to forbear and kind of keep going in the midst of all of the challenges of life. That's a tough one. The fourth one is even harder than those, and that's joyous effort. So we see that, this isn't, I mentioned that this morning that this is kind of the shortest of the four in some regard because the instructions aren't so many, but to sort of have that, enthusiasm for one's practice that you put in, that it becomes stronger and stronger over time. We see how important it is and how hard it is. That's because, we tend to be kind of a bit more kicked back and lazy and, whatever. We take things sort of for granted. We don't necessarily do all the work that we ideally should be doing. But, in the West, I think we struggle with that. And maybe part of that is, we have such a culture that influences us in that way that when we come to our spiritual practice, maybe we just feel like, oh my gosh, I don't really feel like being that enthusiastic about it. But if we really think about it, we should be even more enthusiastic about that. Why? Because it's the answer to everything. Whereas all of our worldly efforts are only the answer for the moment. All of our spiritual efforts will be the answer for everything. They will resolve our own situation and help to resolve the situation of others. So we really need these kinds of practices of rejoicing to help influence our enthusiasm for engaging in the path. So that's why it's called joyous effort or joyous perseverance, is because we need to have that quality together with our rolling up our sleeves and doing the work. So again, this third step was this idea that you want to feel this joy in your heart, not just have kind of thoughts of, oh, that's nice, I'm glad I did that. You really want to feel exuberance, this amazing, joyous feeling. The fourth one is reflect on also on all the good things that you have in your life, whatever brings you joy and contentment, all of which have arisen through the force of your generosity, your compassion, and other good qualities, and take delight in them as well. They are karmic appearances that are arising on the basis of your past good actions. So be delighted that you have these good things in your life. I mean, certainly, the good things in our life, as we talked about earlier, we can have a lot of attachment towards. But if we use them in this way to think about, the good fortune that we had to have those things due to our own karma, a desire to continue to do that, to create the causes for good for ourselves and for others, and even kind of a thought that we're going to use the good things that we have in our life to continue to develop all these qualities. And these are really important things, again, important parts of our path. Then generate the wish for you to experience all happiness, both temporal and ultimate. Remembering again that verse that has to do with this immeasurable joy is the idea that we want to be in a state of well-being and happiness where we don't suffer at all, where we are sort of free of all of that. So it kind of makes sense, when we look at the order of these four, it makes sense to say, equanimity is going to be setting the stage by equalizing everybody to a large degree so we have a same regard for every being. Then we begin to focus on their desire for happiness and cultivate love. And then we focus on their suffering and cultivate compassion. And then we get to a place where we really want to think about rejoicing in whatever good fortune people have by virtue of their conscious efforts to move in the direction of happiness, to abandon their suffering, and eventually to achieve the state where they've achieved complete happiness and freedom from suffering. I do find it kind of interesting. In one of the recent translations of a sadhana that I saw, a particular practice, Rinpoche apparently is encouraging for the second immeasurable love, to change it to, may all beings achieve Buddhahood. Just like one fell swoop, and why talk about happiness and the causes of happiness? Let's talk about the greatest possible happiness and have prayers that they achieve that, and a desire to help them to achieve that. And it makes a lot of sense. And so in regard to this fourth one, where we are talking about the immeasurable joy that we have, we want to think about beings at the culmination of their practice of the path, where they have attained a happiness that is free from suffering, a happiness that no longer is bounded by any of that. So, I think that it's good to have those far-reaching thoughts about, may all beings have Buddhahood, rather than thinking about them having the temporal happiness. But it's included within Buddhahood, because beings need to have temporal happiness in order to become a Buddha. You need to have a life of what we would call leisure, an ability to use this life for good spiritual practice in order to attain enlightenment. So when we wish for beings to achieve Buddhahood, or to be in this state of happiness, free from suffering, it includes everything that precedes that, all of what is needed in order for beings to be in that. So and Kathleen MacDonald even pointed this out, joy is sort of an extension of loving kindness. In loving kindness, we're focused on them being in that state of happiness. With immeasurable joy, we're going to share in the joy of that, kind of be with them together with that, because this will feed our own desire to continue to move in that direction of being able to help others. And it helps us to stay connected with those beings and really encourage them in their path, encourage them in the good things that they do. Yeah, I think it is important. I don't know that we give others as much attention to these sorts of things as what we should. I'm sure parents, I wasn't a parent in this life, so I don't know what that's like, other than watching other people parent their children and having been a child and parented by my dear parents. But I think it is such an important part to reinforce the good behavior of others and the good things that others do, and to say positive things about them, so that they have a good self-regard and a good desire to use their life well, and to find meaning in life and purpose and what have you. But I think this is what we should ideally be doing for others, even beyond childhood, though. A lot of people get into adulthood and they don't feel like they're getting that from anywhere necessarily, and maybe they seek it out in a particular spiritual tradition. But I think it is really good with just your friends, family members, whoever it is that you have in your life, to really occasionally speak to the good things that you see in them, to help them to see that themselves, to help them to generate some joy and confidence in their own good qualities. So anyway, these are a lot of the little peripheral sort of topics that come into play when we start talking about this immeasurable joy and rejoicing. So then, having done that whole mental process, just like the other, two, loving kindness and compassion, we now go on to generate the thoughts that are involved in that. May I never be parted from the happiness of higher rebirth and liberation. That's another way that sometimes this is phrased, right? To say, may all beings never be separated from the happiness of higher rebirth and liberation. May my own good fortune never diminish or depart. So we want to say those thoughts, but again, let your heart be filled with joy upon generating those thoughts. We should be incredibly joyous beings. When we think about it, when we look at the Buddhist path, it's not an easy path. It's an arduous path. I, am reminded of that every day, it seems, and I'm sure many of you have come to the same conclusion. And as many teachings as you've been to, you know that every one speaks to something else that you have to practice, and you go to the Lam Rim and there's no shortage of topics to meditate on and explore. It's a very vast path. It has a lot to offer. And it can be discouraging sometimes because we get involved in, challenging our own minds, trying to move ourselves in a different direction. And that's always difficult. Well, what is the force that will help us most through all of that? It's joy. It's kind of a sense of lightness and a driving energy. One teacher I had way back when I started my Dharma teachings back in San Francisco, when I was receiving teachings from one teacher, he said that that if you're practicing Dharma and it's not joyous and fun, then you're doing it the wrong way. You're not doing it right. I mean, I don't want to put a heavy trip on other people, but the idea is that we really should be incredibly joyous every day, because if kind of depending upon your own level of confidence and conviction in this path and in these teachings, when you begin to see the truth of these teachings for yourself, and you begin to see that what the Buddha has laid out in terms of our path to enlightenment is completely possible, completely doable for ourselves and for all beings. Not in the moment necessarily, but certainly over time, we can develop ourselves to that degree. We should be so thrilled that we've found this path and that we can perhaps become a source for teachings of that path to other people, to help them on their discovery of how to be truly happy, how to find complete freedom from suffering. So again, I think that there's a lot of benefits again to these meditations on joy, rejoicing in this way and so on. But again, generate whatever thoughts that help you to get into that space of thinking about ultimate well-being for yourself, and then let your heart be filled with joy on the basis of that, to feed into that desire to continue practicing. And then cultivating empathetic joy in the goodness of others. Here, once more, I've divided this into friends, strangers, and enemies, because once more, that is how you're generally encouraged to move through the group, is to work with those people you find easiest first, which would be your friends, then move on to the strangers, because there's not a lot of obstacles there, though we might have, some problems opening our heart to them and being joyful around their qualities and activities and so on. But then the enemies gets to be even harder, right? How do we generate a sort of joy with regard to them? Well, we have to do similar things first to set the stage. As it says there under the second bullet point, recall the meditation on equanimity to generate an even-mindedness towards individuals from all three categories. Don't forget to incorporate equanimity in here, because it is important that you have that awareness that that person from whatever group that you're working with is the same as others in a variety of ways, and the biases that we have towards them are really not justified. Then we generate joy with regard to the good qualities, the actions, and the good fortune of those in each of these three groups in a similar way as when working with oneself. So again, it might be hard with the difficult people, because maybe we don't see so much their good qualities. We talked, about how even Adolf Hitler loved his dogs and what have you. I mean, all these things that we might be able to imagine about certain beings that have been very non-virtuous with their lives. But those people who are challenging for us, it does take some time perhaps to get into a place where we can really appreciate their good qualities and their good fortune. But sometimes it doesn't take that much at all if we really kind of look at it, and from the vantage point of everything that people have in their lives, once more, that is a beneficial thing for them, arises from their own good karma. So even when we talk about fame, or we talk about other people liking them and praising them, or we talk about their money, their resources, we talk about all the various things that people have that they possess in their lives, all of that came about through good karma. Whatever that person's doing in this life, however despicable or horrible or, non-virtuous they might be, they still created the good karma to have the good situation that they are currently experiencing, or that they have experienced in the past. So we should be able to, with friends, very easily see the good qualities, see the good actions, all the things that we want to rejoice in. Strangers, we can impute a lot of that without too much problem. Difficult people, maybe we can, again, certainly see that a lot of what they have certainly indicates that they must have done incredible virtuous actions. I mean, people who are born into this life uh, as heirs and heiresses and whatever, that never have to work a day of their life, that don't have to worry about money because they're inheriting all of this from their parents and continuing to live well until they die. You can look at them and think, oh my gosh, and maybe they're not doing anything. They're just like living their lives very frivolously and not really doing anything that's that meaningful. It would be very hard to find sort of sources of joy if you were just looking at their activities, but they created incredible karma to come into this life and not have to do anything to find resources. They created the karma from past lives that ripened into resources in this life. Yes, it's unfortunate if they don't use those resources more meaningfully, but you can still rejoice in their good fortune at having those resources. So I don't know, again, this is just a few side comments on working with these three groups, but you could, again, do the same thing that we did earlier in terms of bringing forth one person from each group and working with them individually just to get an idea. But it is good to, this one might not be as challenging as love and compassion, but nonetheless can still have some challenges in terms of rejoicing and developing an empathetic joy for people in these three categories. Then we go on to doing that for all sentient beings. You can extend this thought to all sentient beings by first recalling that all beings have the potential to know both temporal and ultimate happiness. Again, it's only due to their own obscurations and karma and so on that they aren't experiencing temporal happiness, or even if they have temporal happiness, that they aren't experiencing ultimate happiness. If needed, you might also recall the many ways that they are kind in order to further open your heart to their well-being. So again, the idea here is that we might need that as an impetus, especially with the more challenging beings that we can think about that are in this scope of all beings. But remember, every single being is kind in one way or another, so we can have that understanding and relate to them from that. Then cultivate immeasurable joy with regard to all sentient beings with the following prayer, meditating on each line and taking delight in the well-being of all of them. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings weren't separated from these forms of happiness, the happiness of higher rebirth, which is, again, having a good state with good conditions and so on. And then liberation, which is the more ultimate happiness. And by liberation, we would also include, of course, the ultimate state of liberation or enlightenment, Buddhahood, as an extension of that. And then the idea of we don't want them to be separated from these, and that we ourselves will become an impetus for doing that. But throughout this process of reciting those, it's not just, again, thinking about beings in those states, because then it would really be just the same as immeasurable love. The idea is that we are joyfully together with beings in this state, and being in a state where they are no longer having to suffer, where they are, not even experiencing temporal sufferings to the largest degree, and so on. So again, that's the idea behind this, and then the guru deity, being asked to grant blessings. So there are some teachings that are kind of interesting that we came across in the master's program in some of the other lower tenet systems. I actually taught on some of the tenet systems a little bit up in Denver a couple of years ago. But the idea behind tenets is sort of a looking backward at what the Buddha all taught, how you would summarize it into various schools of thinking, philosophical tenets. And so there are four main tenet systems, and one of the lowest one, which is called Vaibhashika, they actually have a view that there are some beings who attain liberation, who become what they call a foe destroyer. They have completely abandoned all of their afflictions. They've attained that state of nirvana, but they fall from that. For whatever reason, there's some deterioration, and they fall from liberation back into samsaric existence. This isn't a view held by the Mahayana, and it's not held to be a correct view at all. It's only this one tenet system that holds this. So there is a sort of footnote sometimes that this immeasurable joy, when we say never separated from the happiness of higher rebirth and liberation, that we're wanting to make sure we kind of make that strong intention for beings to continue to abide in these states and not decline from that. But again, it's based on a lower tenet and not really a tenet that is held by the schools that we follow, which are the highest of the four is the middle way, the Madhyamaka school. And then we have the Chittamatra mind-only school, the Sautrantika, the Sutra school, and Vaibhashika is usually called the Great Exposition school. And these four schools summarize, again, the different thinkings, thoughts of the Buddha philosophically, and they put things into various categories as to how they present phenomena and how they present the two truths and what the path is like and all the various things. And it's an interesting study. When I taught it up in Denver, I think I only did two of the topics, which were their views of selflessness and emptiness, as well as their view of the two truths, I think. I think that was what I taught, because those seem to be the more relevant ones to some degree, but the other ones are quite interesting too, and have their parallels in terms of Western ways of thinking and sort of tenet systems. But anyway, that's just a little aside, that when we say this kind of, may they never be separated from liberation, well, you can never be separated from liberation according to the highest schools. I'm sorry, you can never. You can't ever. You can never, you can't ever. Once you achieve liberation, it's a lasting state. In fact, when we summarize the goals of Buddhist teachings, we can say that the first one is higher status or higher rebirth, and that's what's taught in the small scope of the Lamrim, is for beings to have good states of existence so that they don't have to experience such gross forms of suffering, and they can actually use those existences more meaningfully. But then the second result summarizes both liberation and enlightenment, and that's what's called definite goodness or certain goodness. It's definite or certain goodness in that higher rebirth isn't definite goodness, it's goodness, but it's not definite because you get a good rebirth and that rebirth doesn't last forever. Eventually that rebirth ends and you may go on to an unfavorable existence. The only way to get definite goodness is to achieve liberation, which is the culmination of the path of the Hinayana practitioner that causes them to remove all of their afflictions and become free from that and abide in a state of solitary peace, nirvana. Or the goal of enlightenment, which is what we're mainly focusing on this weekend and what we tend to focus on mostly in Tibetan Buddhism, which is the state where we go beyond our own liberation and we seek to become a Buddha. You will achieve all the benefits of being liberated, as well. You will completely remove all your own afflictions and you won't have to experience the sufferings of samsara. But you still have to remove some deeper obscurations and achieve enlightenment. But just know that, again, enlightenment and liberation are both certain or definite goodness. If you attain those states, there's no falling from those states. Buddhism doesn't hold to some kind of like great fall that occurred. I grew up with that in Roman Catholicism where it was like there was paradise and Adam and Eve and everything was perfect. And then there was a fall from grace. You know, it's not like we were in some perfect state and suddenly, we declined into this current, mess, this mire that we're in that we call cyclic existence. We've always been in this state and always had the delusions that have caused us to be in this state. But that doesn't mean it has to be that way. And if we can become free of that, it'll be lasting. It'll be unchanging in terms of we won't have to decline from that state and be back in the mess that we've been in since beginningless time. So these are, again, just some concepts that I wanted to introduce here in regard to these ideas of higher rebirth and liberation, whether you can actually be parted from that, because the prayer that we're making seems to say like, well, we don't want them to be separated from liberation. Well, you can't be separated from liberation if you actually achieve liberation. If you achieve enlightenment, you can't be separated from enlightenment. It just is impossible for that to happen. Let me look at my notes and see if there was anything else I wanted to say about joy. Oh, I know. I want to go back and do the near enemy and near enemies and far enemy. Let's put that on the screen. Oops, here it is. So that was the quotes from Kathleen MacDonald. Immeasurable joy, the far enemies to joy are, of course, envy or jealousy. I think these two terms get used rather interchangeably, but technically if you go to a dictionary, I think envy has more to do with something that you thought you deserved, and jealous is something that you think you'd like to have, So, I don't know if I got that right, but nonetheless, they're looking at somebody else's good fortune and not feeling good about it. And this is, of course, why we practice rejoicing, is because we should be delighted that others have good things in their lives, that they get good jobs, or even if we don't get the job and they get the job, we should be happy for them. And I kind of always joke that when you have a sports event in the world, it's not just the United States, anywhere in the world, the fans that who has the losing team, they never feel good for the fans that have the winning team, right? You know, they're always really quite angry and upset. I mean, maybe the players on the field, excuse me, players on the field sometimes congratulate each other. You know, they do that little thing of kind of shaking each other's hands and, you know, being very, commending the other team on what a good job they did. But the fans are like always very upset, right? Like, oh, my team didn't win at all, but they can't be happy for the people who'd had a team that won. You know, it just seems kind of strange. They want that happiness for themselves, but they don't want that happiness for others. This is the type of mind that rejoicing is, you know, to help us to get over, help us to negate. So next time you go to a sports event and your team loses, you know, feel joy for the other fans, you know, wherever they might be. Maybe they're not in the stadium with you or wherever, but feel joy for them that they actually had their team win. How wonderful. We should be glad. We should be so happy for them. And then the second thing that can be a far enemy is kind of interesting. This is set out by Alan Wallace in his book, which originally it was published as Boundless Heart. I think it's been republished as the Four Immeasurables. But anyway, B. Alan Wallace is his name technically. He's got the letter B before it, but Alan Wallace is how he's normally referred to. And on page 145 of that book, he talks about these far enemies. And he doesn't even talk about envy or jealousy. He talks about this combination of cynicism and despair. You know, cynicism being our attitude that is sort of jaded, you know, that we look at things and we're not so, we don't feel so good about it, and we've learned to just have that attitude. And despair, a loss of hope, you know, a sense of futility in the face of what we're dealing with. I found that interesting because, again, if we look at it and we say, well, what does joy do? Joy does counteract those, right? Joy makes us feel really optimistic and good about things. We don't get so cynical and jaded. And we don't despair because we know that it's workable. The situation is something we can, you know, change and do something about. So it does make some sense. Usually envy or jealousy are set out as the far enemies, but it does make some sense to say that we could even have this combination of this sort of, you know, despairing, cynical mind. Um, and this is in the world a lot these days. I find it kind of interesting when I was thinking about this and preparing for this weekend's teachings, is that we do have a lot of this. I mean, this is, here we are in the United States coming up with another major political election, you know, and there are a lot of people who still have that sort of attitude about the country itself. And of course, with what's been going on in the country, I can't blame them in some regard, because it does look pretty dismal and you can become cynical very easily in looking at things. But, you know, we have to find a way to sort of counteract that with some sort of joy and trust in the human spirit and in the spirit of sentient beings, that at the core they're really good and they do have the ability to rise to the occasion when things get tough. And so I think this is an important one for our times in particular. Um, Going back to the screen in terms of the near enemy, the near enemy, it's like frivolous joy. Yeah, the problem with frivolous joy is, you know, it's a state of kind of feeling good about something, but it's very trifling. You know, it's nothing that we should be getting that excited about. It's very mundane. It's sort of undue levity. It lacks the depth and the benefit of this empathetic joy that we've been talking about. So again, I don't know how often we fall into that trap, more than I think with the other ones, we would have the near enemies be a little bit more problematic. Um, so again, our joy, I don't know, with this frivolous joy, I still do kind of struggle myself to really figure out how that is playing a role in regard to being a near enemy. Maybe even if we have kind of a joy that still doesn't acknowledge the gravity of what we are still dealing with. I mean, sentient beings are suffering. Sentient beings in every realm of existence are continuing to be in unbelievable states of suffering. You know, so we can't lose sight of that. We have to make sure, though, that we maintain a joyous attitude to persevere through that and to want to do what we can to bring all beings beyond that, to transcend that. So that's how I see it more, is perhaps we don't want our joy to become sort of too much levity, so that we don't see things in terms of that fundamental teaching that the Buddha gave, of really recognizing that we are all in dukkha. We're neck deep and maybe head deep, beyond our head in dukkha and in suffering. And so we don't want to diminish in any way the gravity of the situation that's going on in the world and in cyclic existence, but nonetheless still cultivate some joy, recognizing that we have to stay focused on that which is positive and that which moves us forward. So I don't know, those are some of my thoughts on this fourth immeasurable of sympathetic joy or empathetic joy. Does anyone have anything that comes up for you that you wanted to share? I mean, maybe you have other teachings from other teachers that you've heard on this that you think would be useful. I haven't heard that many teachings on this fourth immeasurable, frankly, other than the way they teach rejoicing as part of the seven limb practice, So anyone? You don't have to have anything that enlightening to say, that you can just, yes, Jackie, let me make sure you're unmuted here. Yeah.
It's definitely not enlightening to say, but a couple of things is that I just thought that when you mentioned cynicism, how the whole, again, so much of society goes against what we try to do as Dharma practitioners. We're encouraged at a very young age to be cynical. I mean,
Yeah.
it just is pervasive. It's not just politics, isn't it? It's a sort of a badge of maturity when you're a kid, the cigarette, the hang, you know what I mean? So it's very hard, it's hard to realize. It's interesting for me for you to put it on as an antidote. Joy is the antidote, optimism is the antidote. And that was very helpful to
Good.
think about.
Good.
Then the other thing is, apparently, I think you have so much more personal restraint than I do, because I do get into a point where I have a lot of frivolousness. I wouldn't know if it's joy, but it brings up that every time, like, especially after teachers like this, and then I go downstairs and the men have their music on, and it strikes me just as a certain contrast, even if it's an old country drinking song, then I want to, prop me up against the jukebox when I die. You have this elevation of energy in it, don't you? It's like, that I have to, and Justin helps me with this, contain it with body awareness, and bring myself down a little, because I can't get up there. So I think it is very dominant in music scenes and things like that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
You have to always say, Jackie, come down, counteract.
Yeah.
Justin says, I love it. What does he say? Feel the pelvic ground. Like, oh yeah.
Too much, too much. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on the topic of like frivolity or whatever, I was always quite moved when I was over in Italy. They even had a picture from this event. Apparently, Lama Yeshe, when he came to Instituto Lama Tsongkhapa, where I studied, because it's one of our oldest centers, he did like a special talk on, I think it was Christmas Eve or something. And I think it may even be part of the talks that have ended up being Silent Mind, Holy Mind or something, which are some Christmas teachings that he gave. And they said that he had the talk, and then he wanted them to bring in the record player and to bring in the food and to bring it and to just dance, and he wanted everybody to just have a good time.
Be
you know
festive.
yeah, and I think there's nothing wrong with sort of some measure of that in our lives. I think it's, especially when, again, you were talking about kind of how you come out of a Dharma teaching and you feel very full and very energized by things, and you want to express that. Well, I mean, maybe you should go downstairs and dance. I don't it might be good. I think we have to find very skillful ways, again, of keeping this sort of spirit alive. And it's not always going to look pious and holy and whatever the case might be. I don't think we're meant to look pious and holy the whole time anyway. you know I think that we're really meant to be just engaging in life in all of its various facets and features as best as we can. Certainly recognizing that some aspects of life we probably need to avoid because they're not so virtuous and what have you. But yeah, nothing wrong with having some of that in our lives. I think it's really useful. Um, yeah, I don't know. In the master's program, one of the things we found challenging over there, of course, is that we were studying so much during the week and we were all living in community. There were some people who were living off campus, but nonetheless, it was pretty intense. So my job actually was, because I would come back to the US a couple of times a year at least, and I would bring the entertainment, So I would, bring videotapes. We didn't have DVDs at the time until the end of my time there, and then there were DVDs, and people would share those. But I would bring like videotape to movies or things, and we would show them on Saturday nights in the room there, and we'd buy up snacks so that people could have some popcorn or something while they're watching a movie. And it was just kind of a nice way of sort of, again, shutting all that off and sharing time together and enjoying a good film and whatever. And, so I think we need some of that, maybe frivolous joy every now and then. But as Venerable Rabina says, you do it with bodhicitta or you don't do it at all. So, so dance with bodhicitta, go out and celebrate with bodhicitta, do whatever you can, but keep that perspective that it's all part of the path. I have a little talk I do sometimes. It's all about kind of making sure that we're quite integrated in our lives. We tend to be compartmentalized, and we need a congruency between all of this. And our spiritual life should be the container in which our whole life takes place. The idea of what we're here for, what we have as our meaning, our purpose, our driving force in life. We do everything within the context of that. But don't think to compartmentalize, because then it feels really disjointed. It's like, oh, here's who I am when I'm with my family, and here's who I am when I'm at work, and here's who I am when I'm at the Gompa, and here's who I am when I'm with my family. And it gets confusing. It's like you try to keep track of all these different people that you're supposed to be. You should be just one person with one set of rules, one way of living one's life wherever one is, ideally. Yeah. Sure, Jackie. Thank you for bringing that up. So I wonder what they'll be playing today when you go down there. I love some of these titles. When somebody, as a completely off topic, somebody posted a couple of these. Maybe it was actually a part of that wonderful special by Ken Burns on country music that was on PBS, where they had all these titles of these songs that were just hysterical. I mean, I can't believe the titles of some country western songs. Drop kick me Jesus through the goalpost of life, or things like that. Okay, enough of that. Any other comments or questions?
When you were talking about the frivolous joy, I don't know why this popped into my head, but this is a gendered comment, but I think many women can relate to a group of women where one reports that they've met a man, and there's this real excitement and joy, and but as you move through life, you realize that is far from the finish line, and that's wonderful. But there will be subsequent things that you will experience that are not going to be necessarily so joyful. So when you were saying that, that's what sort of came up for me, that it's like, this is nice, but this is not the entire story. So rejoice in this moment, but it's, there's other stuff coming.
And your comments, Heather, just reminded me of how many of us have been to weddings, and weddings are really like joyous experiences where everybody's supposed to be feeling so good for the newly wedded couple and what have you. And then, some of them end up in really nasty divorces, right? Or whatever. I mean, and so it is an interesting part of it, is that we can, have a lot of joy in things sometimes that, are we really seeing the whole picture? So. Okay, let's see. What I want to do with the rest of the time, I'm just going to introduce things, and then I think we'll go ahead and take our break a little bit earlier. It's a bit warm here, and I'm sure you guys are probably warm wherever you are. I need to just kind of get out and stretch a little bit. But what we're going to do is kind of take these four immeasurable thoughts that we've worked on, and again, we've tended to focus on them from a Mahayana perspective. And we're going to insert them in a sense, or think about them in terms of this mind and bodhicitta. And we do have some techniques that I'm going to review briefly. I won't have time to go into them in great detail, but kind of how do those thoughts incorporate into the techniques for developing bodhicitta, and how do we make that kind of a part of this whole process. They sometimes talk about these four immeasurable thoughts. They say that we moisten the mind with the four immeasurable thoughts, and then bodhicitta grows from that. So it's kind of this idea that these four do have an ability to make our minds more pliable, more serviceable, more malleable, so that we can actually move in that direction of bodhicitta. And that's again how they are primarily presented in the Mahayana tradition, especially in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Keep in mind that in the Theravadan tradition, which I don't know inside and out, I've never been a Theravadan practitioner, but certainly reading things like Sharon Salzberg's book on loving kindness, other things I've been exposed to in terms of the four immeasurables from that tradition. As I mentioned, they call them there the four Brahma abodes, because the idea is that they're presented as a way of, by getting in touch with these qualities, of taking rebirth in these sort of Brahma realms, these God realms. And so they're not really taught in the context of bodhicitta, because as the Theravadan tradition is traditionally presented, and again, I can't speak to any particular practitioners because that's their own path. They may be bodhisattvas for all I know. But the Theravadan tradition doesn't teach bodhicitta, it doesn't teach the idea of using this life and future lives to become a Buddha for the sake of others. It tends to focus primarily, again, the path of those who want to achieve individual liberation. So these are good qualities to have, and wonderful things. And some of these Hinayana practitioners or Theravadan practitioners probably have greater compassion and love than a lot of Mahayana practitioners do, like myself. But nonetheless, they do have a different aim for those. But in the Mahayana tradition, it's all about feeding into bodhicitta, feeding into that most important altruistic motivation that is the driving force behind our entire path. Even when we talk about the three scopes of the Lam Rim, it's not like you don't do the first and the second scope with bodhicitta motivation. You're not really introduced into it in a formal way until you get to the great scope. But we even want to start our very path with those sorts of thoughts. That why we are becoming more cognizant of our own mortality, for example, we're doing that with bodhicitta motivation, with the idea that we could actually use this life for the greatest possible benefit. And then we learn those teachings of those particular, sets, stages, and we do that within the context of bodhicitta. So everything becomes flavored with that mind. And that's, again, the goal of our Mahayana path, is to make all of it part and parcel of achieving enlightenment for the sake of others. So I have 157. Let's aim for 205, if that's okay with everybody. Gives you about 7-8 minutes, something like that. And then we'll resume. Okay, I'll pause the recording. During the break, I was reminded from that little talking about the dancing and the Gompa that there was another small teaching that Lama Yeshe gave in Australia that was where he also was encouraging them to do some dancing. I think this was Lama's thing. So I put in the chat box the link to that. The article is called The Dharma of Dancing. You'll find it at lamayeshe.com, but the full link is in the chat box for those in the teaching right now. And what was interesting is I just went in and reread a bit of it. And the very beginning part is about the four immeasurables, what he calls the four limitless thoughts. So it's kind of, he must have been teaching on those that weekend or something. I'm not really sure what was all going on. But so anyway, just you might have a chuckle. And it's also very insightful because he talks about kind of our perspective of things when we're dancing or whatever and all of that. So it's really quite interesting. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the afternoon's topic, which again is incorporating all these, sort of wrapping them all up into bodhicitta. So again, this is at the top of your section on section 5 of your handout, probably around page 10, 11, I can't remember where. But anyway, it says here, the four immeasurables and bodhicitta. On the well-prepared ground of equanimity, the flowers of love are scattered. They are furthered to fruition by the shade of compassion and purified by the clear waters of joy. This is a beautiful little verse that was composed apparently by Yanagarbha. Longchenpa, who's a great Nyingma master. The Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism is the oldest of the four schools of Tibetan Buddhism, or four branches of Tibetan Buddhism. We're the youngest, the Gelugpa. But anyway, Longchenpa is this very famous teacher who apparently quoted this I don't know where the original text is that Yanagarbha said this, but it makes sense. Again, the ground is equanimity, the place that we start from. And then within that, we grow the flowers of love. We have the shade of compassion that protects from the, too much sun and the burning, suffering. And then we have the clear waters of joy that, purify everything, that keep the whole process going. And then there's another quote from Alan Wallace. This is not the book that I was alluding to earlier. That was, again, originally called Boundless Love, Boundless Heart. And that's been republished as the Four Immeasurables. This one is called Genuine Happiness, and it has teachings on the Four Immeasurables as well. He seems to like this idea, and I have done retreats with these Four Immeasurables where you work with calm abiding, and then you meditate on the Four Immeasurables in the other sessions, the alternate sessions. So it's kind of a nice way to do your own little retreat on these if you'd like to, is to do some periods where you do calm abiding, focusing on the breath or some other object, and then in the alternating periods, you meditate on the Four Immeasurables. But anyway, back to the book, he says, following the development of the Four Immeasurables, and just before the cultivation of wisdom, which is, of course, the whole wisdom wing of the Buddha's teachings, comes the crown jewel of all of Mahayana Buddhism. In Sanskrit, it is called bodhicitta, which I translate as the spirit of awakening. Usually, I'd say a more preferred one is the mind of enlightenment, but a lot of people just simply use bodhicitta. We just have gotten to know what that means, and we don't need to necessarily translate it. Bodhicitta is the heartfelt aspiration to achieve spiritual awakening for the sake of all beings, an aspiration fusing the two noblest goals. And this is how he lays them out. I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but he says the first goal is to seek enlightenment, as it says there, the heartfelt aspiration to achieve spiritual awakening, to achieve enlightenment. But pursuing this aspiration for oneself alone ignores something fundamental about the nature of our existence. None of us lives in isolation, independent of those around us. Our existence is one of interrelationship. Thus, our aspirations must include the welfare of others. This brings us to our second noble aspiration. What can I do to help? So again, this is the idea behind bodhicitta, is that it has two main thoughts behind it. The way he presented it, the first one is to achieve enlightenment. And often we say that, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit other sentient beings, which is the second aspiration, the idea that we want to help others. We want to be of some benefit to them in their quest for happiness and their desire to be free from suffering. Now, Lama Zopa Rinpoche always, and it is the way that it's traditionally presented as well, is to recognize that the main motivation, the one that is primary and central to all of it, is to benefit all beings. It's just that the second one is what is needed in order to accomplish that. I often use the example of, say you have a young girl who's had a lot of people in her life who have been, unfortunately, plagued by cancer. So she might have people who've survived it, some people who she's lost to cancer in her family. Well, she might get really motivated as a quite young girl to want to deal with this in a more constructive way, to become an oncologist or to become a cancer researcher, to do something along those lines, because she has been touched by it so much in her own life. She's seen the suffering of cancer and she wants to alleviate it. Well, we know that as that young girl, she's not going to be so effective in being an oncologist. She's not going to be a good cancer researcher. Why? Because she doesn't have the skills and ability to do that. She has to, dedicate herself to the sciences and all the things she needs to do to focus on in her younger education, and then go into university, a good medical school if she's going to become an oncologist or even a researcher, whatever, and then pursue the path that follows from that. And then when she gets to a place where she can actually do that work, then she can fulfill that wish to benefit those who have cancer by researching or by treating them or whatever the case might be. So we see that again, this makes complete sense in the light of bodhicitta as well. If we really get clear, as we have already done in terms of our four immeasurables of the situation that beings are in, We see them under the control of their own crazy attachment to friends and hatred towards enemies, and we want them to be free of that, their indifference to strangers, all of that. And then we see how they really want to be happy, and we want them to have the causes of that, in spite of the fact that most sentient beings run away from the causes of happiness. They don't flee towards them. And then in terms of compassion, we see that sentient beings don't want to suffer, and we want them not to suffer, in spite of the fact that they run towards the causes of suffering, even though they would rather flee them. And then again, this is just developing our understanding of the situation that beings are in. We become greatly moved to want to benefit them. And as I pointed out in the Mahayana way of presenting the Four Immeasurables, we're always including that third level, that altruistic intention, that desire to actually be the force by which beings will be placed in happiness and free from suffering and be free from their attachment and hatred, and finally abide in a state where they are completely free of any suffering and abiding in liberation and enlightenment. So the main motivation, the one that is driving us on this whole path, is to benefit others. And we recognize that without becoming enlightened, we can't do that to the greatest degree. Just like the young girl can't help cancer patients to the greatest degree while she is uninformed, doesn't have the education and the qualifications in order to do the deeper work. So again, this is, I find it a very effective example to work with in regard to this. So that does mean that we have to have some opening and awareness of the state that we ourselves are in and that other beings are in, and develop that compassion that is really the root of it, though loving kindness is obviously a part, but that real sincere desire to address the problems that the world is facing, in terms of not the problems that are happening in our time, the big problem, which is the fact that beings are going from life to life under the control of their karma and delusions and never finding the happiness that they seek. So we want to become a Buddha so we can do that most effectively. So it was kind of interesting that Alan Wallace presented it in this way. This is, again, how the definition is usually set out. It's the mind seeking enlightenment for the welfare of all beings. But when you get into describing it, you find that the main motivation is to benefit all sentient beings. What assists that motivation, what acts as a means for accomplishing that motivation, is becoming a Buddha, becoming enlightened. So again, I liked his words in terms of it being the crown jewel of all the Mahayana teachings. It really is such an important mind, something that is emphasized so greatly in the Mahayana path. As you know, or may have seen, the techniques for developing bodhicitta, there are two of them. There's a third one where you combine, these techniques into one. But essentially, these are taught as part of the entryway into the Mahayana, into the great scope in the Lam Rim. Because bodhicitta is sort of having seen one's own suffering and developed some level of renunciation, a desire to turn away from one's own stay in existence and so on, that we actually translate that for others. We see that everyone else is in the same predicament. So let's go through this and see, again, what's presented here. Hopefully we can get through all of this in the time that we have left. What I'm going to share with you are both of these techniques. I don't have on these sheets the combined technique, but the combined technique sort of takes the best of each of these and puts them together into a beautiful way of meditating where you bring in the effects from both of these. This first one is called Cultivating Bodhicitta through the Sevenfold Cause and Effect Technique. It's recognizing that each step acts as a cause for generating the next step, which is its effect, and then that acts as a cause for the next step, and then the next step all the way up to the final effect, which is bodhicitta. The preliminary thought for this one, as well as for the other technique that we're going to talk about next, is developing equanimity within one's own mind. So it's not the immeasurable equanimity where we're wanting all sentient beings to be in this state of freedom from attachment for friends and so on. It's the idea that we ourselves have to develop an even-mindedness towards all beings. I think this was pointed out earlier when we went through immeasurable equanimity, is the importance, of course, of having that attitude ourselves, is because we're going to be blocked to generating loving kindness and compassion towards others. Therefore, we're going to be blocked to generating the motivation to want to benefit them through becoming a Buddha ourselves. These are all part of the process of developing bodhicitta. So if we can't even get to a place where we can cultivate that love that pervades all beings and that compassion that pervades all beings, then it's going to be problematic. If we exclude any being from our heart, we can't make our bodhicitta complete. If we think, oh, I'm going to become enlightened for the sake of all beings except, and we have our little footnote, with a whole list of all the people, all the beings that we say, no, thank you, I'll pass on them. I'm not going to become a Buddha for their sake. They're hopeless. They're beyond my scope. We want to be including everyone. We want to have a mind that will open up to everyone. So again, that's why equanimity is taught right at the beginning. And it is generally the first two of the three meditations we had. Remember, we had the one on impermanence, how the relationships are constantly changing. The person who right now is a friend may have been earlier in this life an enemy or a stranger, might in the next life be, our worst enemy. Who knows? All of this is floating around, changing from life to life and even within a life, that we can't call that a stable basis for our attitudes towards them. So we have to equalize our attitude and have an equal regard for them because of the impermanence of those relationships. But we can also bring in the understanding again that other beings have different relationships with those beings that are in certain categories for us, they're in different categories for other people. So there's no sort of inherent friend that is a friend to everybody in the world. And even the Buddha, the Buddha had his cousin Devadatta, who hated him, who despised him, who tried to kill him. So even you have a fully developed being who has no faults whatsoever, and still you're going to have people who dislike him, who see him in their enemy camp, right? In their little theater, Devadatta's theater, the Buddha was the enemy, interrupting his show. So, again, this is just indicative of the reality that every being is going to be seen in different light by different people. And that's just a part of existence. So once more, we don't have that stable basis on which to determine what attitudes of attachment, animosity, or aversion, indifference. So that's the main ones that are used. Again, the third of those three thoughts that were introduced with immeasurable equanimity, the one where we see beings as the same, you can use some of that certainly. But the main way that we talk about them being the same in terms of their wanting to be happy and wanting to not suffer, that's actually used in the next technique, equalizing and exchanging self and others. So just know that you're going to see that repeated there, but there's nothing wrong, I think, with using those in the context of developing equanimity as the basis for bodhicitta in this sevenfold cause and effect. So that's the preliminary step. The very first of the sevenfold cause and effect is perceiving all sentient beings as having been one's mother. I was talking earlier about how we, can see beings through that light of having been incredibly kind. Well, one of the ways that beings have been kind to us, it said, is that they have all been our mother at one time or another. No doubt they've been our mother many times. This is based on the thought and the understanding that our lives are limitless. There is no beginning to our lives. We struggle with this concept of beginningless time. I know it's really hard. When I talk to my Christian friends in the interfaith organization here, it boggles their mind. I mean, they believe that God started the world that we live in and that there was a beginning point. And Westerners love this idea of a beginning point. Well, there's never been a beginning to your consciousness. Your consciousness has been around for eternity and will always be around. I guess that's the comforting thing, is that some portion of what we are continues on. It's our consciousness, our awareness. And it will continue on even into the state of Buddhahood. When we achieve that state, it's not like it goes away or disappears. Mind is continually giving rise to another moment of mind. And when we get to the end of a particular life, through the force of our karma, we take another rebirth. And every rebirth that we've been born, where there was a womb involved, where there was an egg involved, we would have had to had a mother, right? Now, some mothers obviously care more for their offspring than others do. But in every existence where we've needed a mother, a being has played that role. And in that measure, and even in just that way, we can say that they've shown us some kindness. So going back to that idea of meditating on the kindness of beings, here we start off with this, what again in Buddhist terms is a fact. We might entertain it initially as sort of a hypothesis, an idea, well, maybe all sentient beings have been my mother. But in Buddhism, we say, in fact, every sentient being has been your mother. Donald Trump was your mother, Adolf Hitler was your mother, Mother Teresa was your mother. Any being that you look at in the world was your mother at one time or another in some existence. Because you've had countless rebirths, you've needed a mother every time you were born in those ways. So that's the very first step. And they say actually that that is one of the hardest realizations in the Lam Rim to get, is to actually see all beings as having been your mother. But we even use this term frequently, right? We say mother sentient beings. May all my mother sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. It wasn't in our prayer itself, but you could insert it in there. You could always say that with it so that you recognize that all beings have been your mother. Now, why is mother chosen? And if you've had a mother in this lifetime that was problematic for you, I can understand that, is something that definitely happens in our world. It doesn't mean that you have to get locked into that view of mother. Mother is a very powerful archetype in our culture. If we go back centuries, you can see the role of like Mother Mary with the child Jesus and so on, and all of this kind of what mothers symbolize in our culture. They don't always live up to that symbolization, but maybe that's unfair to hold them up to that. But mothers do play a pretty important role in regard to this human existence specifically. And those of you who've had the good fortune of having a good mother, you can use her as the idea from which to extrapolate all of this. But nonetheless, if you didn't have a loving, kind, caring mother, if your mother gave you away at birth, you were adopted by another family, whatever the case might be, well then, you still can use the archetype of a mother. I encourage people to use mother regardless of what your experience was in this lifetime with a mother. But it is said that if you do have problems with using mother, no problem with using father, no problem with using grandmother if you had a grandmother that was very loving and kind, or a sister or a brother or whoever it is that was integral in your development. So the second step after kind of seeing beings as having been that, because the fact is, just one more note on that, the fact is every being has also been your brother and your sister and your grandmother and your grandfather and whoever else. They've all been in those roles. We've never had a sentient being that wasn't in those roles, one time or another. Having kind of seen them through that fact, through that understanding, we then go on to remember their kindness. And here, because we're using somebody who would have been in that friend category, we think about the ways that they were directly and intentionally kind to us, caring for us, especially when we were quite vulnerable. When we were young and could not fend for ourselves, we would have died in our crib, had our mother not fed us and taken care of us and gotten up in the middle of the night to do things for us and so on. When we were sick, to make sure that we got medicine and saw a doctor and whatever. Incredible things that mothers and other, fathers as well, but certainly, our mothers have to go through to raise their children. Then we develop the wish to repay that kindness, similar to the gratitude that we felt when we talked about the kindness of other beings. That we recognize that it's not enough just to say, wow, these beings have been really kind to me. I have to want to reciprocate that kindness. And that's what, of course, feeds into the love and compassion that followed in the Four Immeasurables from equanimity. But they're going to follow from this as well. They are the next steps once we recognize how others have been really involved in our welfare and how we can't neglect them, therefore. Then we make the determination to do something about that. Already at this third step, there should be some sort of assessment of how do I repay that kindness? How do I reciprocate? If we look at just this world that we live in, and of course the Buddha says there are many worlds and of course different realms of existence and so on. But if we look at just this world and even just the humans of this world, there are 8 billion humans almost in this world. Are you going to be able to repay in this lifetime the kindness of those 8 billion who have been your mother in one lifetime or another, who happen to be human in this life right now? And even if you paid every one of them $1, which I don't know where you'd get $8 billion. I don't have $8 billion. You'd have to go to a super billionaire to get that kind of money. then they're going to get $1. Does $1 repay the kindness that they did for you when they were your mother? All of the hard work and effort that they put into that? Not really, So paying them off in a material way doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I can't also say, well, I hope that I'm going to make the prayer that I'm a really good mother for them when I end up being their mother. And that's not really the way we'd want to repay their kindness. We've met with the Dharma in this life. We've met with as I was saying, this incredible source of joy, because we now know what is keeping us in this situation. We now know how to get out of this situation. And moreover, we know how to become a Buddha so we can help others to do that. So we should already be making a determination at this stage that we want to do whatever we can to help beings beyond just mundane concerns, to help them to actually know true freedom from suffering and to develop their qualities completely. So already at this point, you could say there could be some semblance of a sort of bodhicitta, because you're already thinking beyond just mundane things for others, worldly things for others. Based on those first three thoughts, which sort of set the stage, you then go on to cultivate the two qualities of love and compassion, which are very similar to the way we looked at immeasurable love and immeasurable compassion, where we have once more that great love that has the intention to place all beings in happiness with the causes of happiness, and the great compassion that has the intention to free all beings from suffering and the causes of suffering, which once more is already incorporated to a degree when we recite that prayer, when we get to the third line and say, I myself will place all beings in happiness and the causes of happiness. I will cause them to have that. So these are, not so different, and they are once more encouraged to be manifested or realized in the same order I talked about. Work initially with people who are very dear to you, then work with strangers, and then work with the difficult people. And you cultivate those kinds of loving thoughts that are dedicated to helping all beings to have happiness. And then the fifth one, doing the same with compassion. Very similar to the way I presented it. There's not a lot of difference when it comes to the presentation here in this technique and what I talked about in terms of immeasurable love and immeasurable compassion. It's just making sure you get to that place where you say, I need to do this for others. It's not enough to want that for them. I actually have to have the intention to place them in happiness, and so on. Then the sixth and the seventh step, we're going to see those repeated with the other technique. They have this additional step called developing the pure, superior, altruistic intention, which is kind of like advancing this even further. You've already said, I have the intention, I have the great love that is intent upon placing sentient beings in happiness, helping them to have the causes of happiness. I have the great compassion that is intent upon removing their suffering, and so on. So what is this additional resolve? It's the idea that we will take this upon ourselves and do whatever is necessary. It's kind of the active component of it. The previous ones were the thoughts of great love and great compassion. It now has that dimension of, I will do whatever it takes. Even if I have to do this by myself alone, if I have to do all the work of enlightening all sentient beings, wherever they exist in whatever realms, as limitless and immeasurable as those sentient beings are, I will take that on. It's sort of a signing up for a greater level of commitment. And then, of course, that begs the question, I can't do that in my current state. How will I possibly be able to do that? What will enable me to actually benefit beings to that degree? The only thing that will enable you is by becoming a Buddha yourself. Therefore, you arrive at bodhicitta, which once more is the intention to become enlightened so you can accomplish everything that you've meditated on, so you can place all beings in happiness, so you can free them all from suffering. Through your being a Buddha, you will then be able to work perfectly for the welfare of others. Now that's the technique that's the sevenfold cause and effect, and it kind of makes sense in terms of these various thought processes, each feeding into the next one. All beings as my mother, I recall their kindness, I want to repay their kindness. I do that by wanting them to be happy and become the cause for doing that for them. I want them to be free of suffering, and my becoming a cause for that. I need to do that with the greatest possible, effort, even if it is by myself alone. Therefore, I have to dedicate myself to the path to enlightenment, to developing my mind completely, so I then can help others. Now, immeasurable joy can be cultivated as well to strengthen bodhicitta, as it says in that second to last bullet point. Joy can be generated throughout all of this. The joy that thinks about beings obtaining the happiness that they seek, being free from the suffering that they want to be free from, and so on. And the joy that we take in our own dedication to that. And then when you finally arrive at the mind of enlightenment through this meditation technique, you can stabilize on that. Now, this is a lot to meditate on in a single session. Usually what they encourage you to do is work with each of these individually for some time, and then they begin to feed into each other. But ideally, we want to stabilize on bodhicitta as much as possible so that we can deepen it in our hearts. It's said that as you become more and more familiar with these techniques and you start generating bodhicitta to greater and greater degrees, eventually if you have a depth of concentration, such as calm abiding, that can be a support for making you you become a bodhisattva at that point. Let's put it that way. You have what is called uncontrived or spontaneous bodhicitta, meaning that through the force of your familiarity with bodhicitta, through meditating on that technique and the other technique and the combined technique and continuing to develop that mind and, and stabilize it, and then through the force of your meditative concentration that makes that very stable, you can actualize bodhicitta in your mind so that you become technically a bodhisattva at that level. We all can be called bodhisattva wannabes, and at least I'm projecting on you the same lack of spontaneous bodhicitta that I have. I'm not on that path yet. I'm not a bodhisattva yet. But technically, you enter into the Mahayana path when you have that mind of uncontrived bodhicitta, where you've realized it through the force of your meditation so strongly that it's with you all the time. All you have to do is you see a sentient being, you immediately go, I need to become enlightened for that being. You don't have to think about, oh, that being was my mother, and then they showed me kindness, and then I want to repay that kindness, and then I generate love, and I generate compassion. You are so filled with all of those previous thoughts that bodhicitta naturally, spontaneously arises. But once more, it can't be divorced from some level of meditative concentration. All the Buddha's realizations are based on some level of meditation. You can't say that you gained any realizations. You can have like shades or some sort of shadow of a realization in our minds by virtue of our understanding at this point. But we don't really have a realization until we know things much deeper, till they become fused with our mind at a deeper level. So this is the idea behind these techniques, is that we become familiar with them through meditating on them, and eventually they become actualized in a sense. And that's when we become a Buddha, a bodhisattva, and practice the path that eventually arrives at Buddhahood. One thing to keep in mind is that prior to the realization of bodhicitta is renunciation. You do have to have a stable realization of renunciation prior to that. Remember that renunciation is the self-compassion, where we look at our own situation and we decide, I've had enough of samsara, thank you very much. As good as things might be, as pleasant and delightful as this is and that is, it's all dukkha, it's all unsatisfactory, and I want to turn away from it and turn towards liberation. That precedes bodhicitta. That's why, again, in a lot of these techniques, we looked at generating those thoughts for ourselves first, really wanting ourselves to be free from suffering, wanting ourselves to be happy, because that's where it all starts. We have to have that realization around our own well-being first, and then we can apply that to other beings and come to understand that they're exactly like us, and therefore we can be dedicated to their welfare as well as our own, which is what bodhisattva or bodhicitta is about, right? May I become a Buddha myself, that's the fulfillment of my own welfare, so I can benefit other beings, which is the fulfillment of their welfare. So we have to start with, at least having some regard for ourselves, some concern for ourselves. Then we can develop the genuine concern for others. Now, to go through the other technique somewhat briefly, this is a technique that, again, is called equalizing and exchanging self and other. It doesn't mean an actual physical exchange, like I'm not going to, ask Christian to move into my house and take over my job and what I do, and I'm going to move up there and do it. And it's not a physical exchange. It is the idea that we have been holding ourselves, to be the most important through this mind that is called self-cherishing, self-centeredness, and we have been neglecting the welfare of others. This is kind of our default mode. We do spend a lot of our day thinking about what I need, me, myself, and I. So this technique, the first technique, was all about developing that sense of closeness to being so that we can feel really compassionate and loving and kind and caring towards them. Here it's about getting rid of the obstacle that blocks our complete opening to the welfare of others, which is our tendency to get focused on ourselves. That can even manifest, they say, in very subtle ways. For those on the Hinayana path, for example, who are intent upon their own liberation, they can have some very slight sense of self-cherishing where they aren't seeing the possibility that and opening up to that possibility that they could benefit all beings. They would rather, because of their mindset, simply get rid of their own suffering and their own state of existence and move into a state of nirvana. They have, again, it's said to be a very subtle state of self-cherishing that is in their minds, but nonetheless it acts as a obstacle to achieving complete enlightenment. Well, most of us have it at a much grosser level. We're not on the Hinayana path and thinking about, oh, I need to get the heck out of samsara, bye everyone, hope it works out for you. Instead, we're just in samsara, neck deep, and continuing to create the causes for our own problems because of this mind of self-cherishing. Because self-cherishing is what causes us to engage in unhealthy karma. It's what causes us to neglect the welfare of others and thereby, frequently harm them and harm ourselves in the process. They say that the mind of self-cherishing or self-centeredness is the source of all suffering. Master Shantideva, in his 8th chapter, I think this is around verse 129, he says, all the suffering there is in the world comes from wanting happiness for oneself alone. Then it goes on to say, of course, the other side of it, that all the good there is in the world, all the happiness there is, comes from wanting happiness for others. When we hear these words, we kind of know the truth of them to some degree. This isn't something we're completely blind to. And we can look at our world, and I can't help but once more keep going back to our current situation. When we see people like those amazing healthcare workers on the front line who are just giving so much day in and day out in so many parts of our country and the world, to care for others, we know that that's a source of true joy when people are that selfless and giving to others and not even so concerned about themselves. Yeah, they want their PPE. They want to make sure they protect themselves so they can keep doing that work, but they're not exhibiting selfishness by doing that. They're actually showing even greater concern that they want to make sure that they can continue to do that for all the patients who come into the hospitals and so on. We know that that feels good to think about that and rejoice in that and be happy about that, because we know that the mind that cherishes others is actually the ideal place to be. And as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, this is actually the way to be wisely selfish. If we look at it from that point of view, that is our sort of fundamental basis. We all want to be happy. We don't want to suffer. Well, how do we best meet that need that we've let become selfish? We've let it become very much about my happiness and my freedom from suffering. If we want to actually accomplish that, be focused on others. It's a win-win situation. If you are cherishing other beings, they will benefit from that, and you will benefit from that. If you are cherishing yourself and neglecting other beings, they will lose from that because you're not attending to them and caring about them, and you will lose from that because you only create negative karma and be preoccupied with yourself and your own needs and so on. That leads to just unskillful karma. So the way to be wisely selfish, His Holiness says, is to actually care for others, to cherish others, to be attentive to their needs. So that's kind of a background. I covered like a number of the points in here in this meditation. The beginning step, as usual, as before, was to cultivate this sense of equanimity, thinking about, again, the impermanence of these relationships, thinking about the different perspectives that other people have, and so on. And then we get to the actual technique of generating bodhicitta. The first step of equalizing oneself and others is to acknowledge that all beings are the same as oneself. This is kind of like, let me take it off the screen here. when we have the mind of self-cherishing, we think of me here and everybody else sort of down here. They're all our subjects in a sense. Everybody's job is to take care of me. We don't think it that grossly, but that's kind of how we live our lives. It's just like we just want everybody to keep doing what they can to please and take care of this self. Well, we first have to equalize, at least bring us to the same level. And how we do that is through that one contemplation I mentioned earlier. We see that all beings are just like ourselves in wanting to be happy, wanting to not suffer. Moreover, they're like ourselves because even though they have those motivations of avoiding suffering and becoming happy, they are still bereft of happiness. They still have to suffer. We're all in the same predicament. There are other contemplations that can be added in there that also help to equalize. I mentioned when I talked on Friday night, I think it was, about working with fear, that, I don't know, maybe that was Wednesday night, I'm losing track, but where I talked about death being the great equalizer, or illness being the great equalizer when we saw this with coronavirus and what have you. But nonetheless, we need to see that all beings are in the same boat. And that is one of the meditations that's sometimes suggested, is to recognize that we all die. We're all subject to death. At that level, we're all in the same boat. Of course, we've been hearing that a lot during this pandemic, right? We're all in this together. Well, those are good thoughts to have. I mean, it gets to be a little overworked at times, but we really have to recognize that we are all in this together. I mean, even those who've maybe shown some resistance to coronavirus and have some sort of natural immunity, it seems, and aren't really experiencing it, they're still dealing with the consequences of this virus in this world. They can't get away from that. This is putting us all in this one big pot, and we're recognizing that. Well, we have to see that we're in the same pot, in the same boat in many ways. And those are the step of equalizing, bringing ourselves down a bit and others, up, so that we have at least an equal regard. The rest of the technique is the exchange of self and others. So we were up here, they were down here. Now we're going to bring them up here and ourselves down here, not in a self-denigrating way, in a recognition again that this is the way to achieve the greatest happiness for others and ourselves, is to be dedicated to their welfare. So back in the steps, after equalizing self and others, we go on to the techniques of exchanging. And the first and the second are what I just covered a few minutes ago, that there are great shortcomings if we continue to cherish ourselves, hold ourselves as more important, and not do that exchange. And there are great advantages if we do that exchange. Verse 130 of that chapter 8 of Master Shantideva says, again, I'm paraphrasing a little bit on this one, he says, look at the difference between the Buddhas and ourselves. You need not say anything more, in a sense, because Buddhas have dedicated themselves to the welfare of others and they've attained the goal. We've been dedicating ourselves to our own welfare, and look at where we're at. We're just in another existence within our endless existences in samsara, seemingly endless. Certainly they're beginningless. But this is the evidence is that there are great advantages if we do this exchange. Therefore, in step 4, we have to make that determination that we are going to exchange, that we can exchange ourselves and others, that we can do this. All the Buddhas of the past have done this. So, having made that determination, the next step is where we incorporate compassion and love using the technique of Tonglen, taking and giving. It's technically Tong is giving, Len is taking, but it's done taking away the suffering of others and giving them our happiness, which is the exact opposite of what the self-cherishing mind wants. The mind that wants us to be first, to get, what we need for our well-being and forget everybody else. It wants the best parts for ourselves, and it doesn't want any of the negative. Thank you very much. I'll pass that along to someone else. Here we want to be exactly the opposite. I will take whatever is undesirable. I will take all that happiness, or suffering, and be willing to experience it. And I will give you all my happiness, everything that I find delightful and enjoyable. Now, again, does this mean you actually have to do that? You have to go to the hospital where there are coronavirus patients and somehow, take on their illness and get in the bed with where they were and let them go out and live your life and be. It isn't the physical exchange, it's the mental exchange. And it does become challenging if we really put our minds and hearts into it, because it involves that willingness, the willingness to take on the suffering of others, the willingness to give away what we have that brings us happiness to others. One little quote that I like to share here is from Pema Chodron, and I think it's in her book, No Time to Lose, that's been republished, something like Becoming Bodhisattvas. It's her commentary on Shantideva's text. And she says that one of her teachers was asked once by a student, they said, if you're doing Tonglen, taking away the suffering of another, and you're working with somebody with cancer, for example, aren't you afraid that you might take on their cancer, that might actually happen? I'm going to visualize taking their cancer and then I'm going to actually get it. And this teacher said, nothing would make me happier. I mean, that's where you want to get with this, is that you would be delighted to exchange places with a COVID-19 patient right now, to free them from the suffering they're going through and to go through it in their place. Again, we can't do that physically. I'm just using this as an example of how much we need to work on developing that type of attitude. That is the culmination of the mind that cherishes others, whereas the mind that cherishes ourselves is problematic and needs to be overcome and will be overcome by this powerful technique of Tonglen. So I'm not going to go into all the description of this. I did a little bit on Tonglen the other night. Essentially, the taking part involves taking on the suffering of others through the power of the motivating vision of great compassion, which is essentially our immeasurable compassion with that intention to free others from suffering because we are willing to take that on ourselves. And it can be done with the breath and can be certainly done with visualizations of sort of taking sort of a smoke, an uncomfortable thing from that person that is sort of the embodiment of their suffering, breathing it in, taking it into oneself. And then giving away your happiness to others through the power of the motivating vision of great love, which again is that immeasurable love, but with the intention to actually do that, to place beings in happiness. And here it manifests in the form of me sending out, light energy that becomes everything that others need, that is everything that I have that brings me happiness. I'm going to give it away to others. I'm not going to keep it for myself. Of course, this is all aimed at overcoming the self-cherishing mind. It's not aimed at making us sick and miserable and awful people. It's to help us to get rid of what is making us sick and miserable and awful people. So there are instructions out there on Tonglen. I don't know that I can go into much more with the time that we have. But joy is a key part of that practice. Sometimes they even say to pause after each of these and generate joy. After you feel like you've taken away all the sufferings of whoever it is you're working with, you can start with yourself, you can work with friends, then strangers, then enemies. Do it in a very similar way to what we did and with immeasurable compassion. You can stop and rejoice when you get to that place where you feel that you've taken away all their suffering. And you can stop and rejoice when you think about having placed them in ultimate happiness. Joy should feed into this very much. And then finally, you get to the same 2 points that I mentioned that you would see in this later technique, which is developing that pure intention, seeing that this was just a visualization. I've generated these thoughts, but I still have to do the work, and I still have to place all beings in happiness and lead them out of suffering, and I will do whatever it takes to do that. Therefore, I have to become a Buddha for their sake. And so when you arrive at that thought, you stabilize on that. Okay, so before I do those additional little practices, any questions on that? I realize that was a very quick survey of the two techniques. As I said, there's an 11-step technique that starts with equanimity. It pulls the first three of the sevenfold, seeing beings as your mother, their kindness, and wishing to repay it. Those are the first four then. Then it goes into recognizing the disadvantages of self-cherishing, the advantages of cherishing others, and then goes on to taking away suffering, becomes its own step, giving them happiness, developing their altruistic intention, and then achieving bodhicitta. And I may have missed one in there. Oh, equalizing self and others. That precedes meditating on the disadvantages of cherishing others, not exchanging self and others. Anyway, you can find that 11-fold technique in Pabanka Rinpoche's Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand as well. Sorry, I asked for questions and I kept talking. Any questions or comments? Okay, everybody's tired, I think. It is a long weekend. Let's just go back to finish off the handout because I think there are some juicy bits in there at the end that I really do want to encourage you to work with as well. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he works with the Four Immeasurables. Those Four Immeasurable Thoughts, again, the handout has been sent to you that has them all on one page with the 4 individual thoughts within each of them, and then has special bodhicitta at the end. He advises doing Tonglen while you recite the Four Immeasurables. So with the prayer for cultivating immeasurable equanimity, meditate briefly on taking all the disturbing emotions of sentient beings and giving them to your self-cherishing thought, thus destroying it. Doesn't mean that you want to become, filled with attachment and hatred or whatever. You're going to kind of use that as a sort of bomb to destroy the self-cherishing mind, willing to take away all of the biases, the partiality that beings have that are afflicted in nature, and by virtue of that, destroy your own self-cherishing. Then, when you cultivate the second prayer, the prayer for immeasurable love, which again was in handout 2, but is all on that one handout that you were sent today, transform your body into a wish-granting jewel that gives every sentient being every kind of temporal and ultimate happiness that they desire and need. So you do giving with that. You did taking with equanimity. You do giving with love. Then you do taking with compassion, where you take on the sufferings and causes of suffering of all sentient beings. And then joy, you give all your merits of the past, present, and future and all their results, including enlightenment, to all sentient beings so they can know that state of complete happiness, of liberation and enlightenment. And then you can do, of course, the special bodhicitta prayer at the very end of the Four Immeasurables. This is a very powerful way to kind of move all of those 4 into bodhicitta, saying in particular, I must achieve enlightenment quickly in order to free all the numberless kind mother sentient beings from the unimaginable oceans of samsaric suffering and causes of suffering, and lead them to peerless full enlightenment. For this purpose, I'm going to undertake the practice of, and you can insert there whatever practice you're engaging in. If you're going to just sit down and meditate, you could say I could undertake the practice of meditating on the breath, or meditating on compassion, or meditating on emptiness, or whatever it is that you're doing. And again, the remaining pages are the 2 addenda, so I don't know that I need to go through anything more there. And again, I put that special bodhicitta prayer on the page with the 4 immeasurable prayers, so you have those to work with as just a standalone document besides the notes that give you more advice on meditating on all this. So again, I realize I've given you like the cup's full and probably overflowing. Maybe since like yesterday it was already overflowing. I don't know. It's hard to take in a lot of information over such a short span of time. But what I would encourage you to do is just let this sort of bounce around your head a bit. And if there's a particular thing that you're drawn to, it's okay just to sort of pick one of these things and work on that. They obviously are meant to sort of play some structure in terms of feeding into bodhicitta. But for a lot of us, we're not that far along the path to where we have to be that attentive to it. It's good to just take in what resonates with you. So if right now you're really feeling like you need to have a bit more opening to compassion, well, then work on that. And maybe you want to start with just self-compassion. It's perfectly fine to start where you are and just choose what works. Further down the path, yes, it makes sense to be very structured about it and to say, okay, I'm going to get some realizations at these lower levels and keep working my way up in the graduated path. But nonetheless, right now, most of us just need something that's going to help us to some degree. It's going to help us keep our hearts open, keep us with that kind heart. This is where I'd like to share as sort of the closing, a wonderful little quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He says, whether one believes in a religion or not, and whether one believes in rebirth or not, there isn't anyone who doesn't appreciate kindness and compassion. So just keep that in mind that, no matter what people are believing or doing or thinking or saying or tweeting or whatever the case might be, everyone appreciates a kind heart to some degree. We might challenge that with certain people, but nonetheless, I would challenge that. I think there is some opening, to an appreciation of a kind heart, some compassion, some measure of kindness. It actually can go a long way in this world, and it's very much needed in this world. So I wish you well with your practice of these 4 immeasurables, and glad that I had the opportunity to teach on these. Are there any final comments from anyone else? This has been great reconnecting with all of you. I'm finding that these online teachings, as much as they can be not quite the same thing, they're still very, very rich in terms of being in a virtual space with others is good. It's not the same as, but it's nonetheless really, really good. So I appreciate that. So yeah, were you going to say something, Heather? Or, no?
I'm not sure if Catherine's just stepped away or not.
Oh, I'm not
First of
sure either.
all, thank you so much. I think this is just wonderful, and I know if Catherine were, there she is.
There she is.
Sorry, I'm here.
That's okay. To do the, I was just going to say, Catherine, a virtual kata, etc. If you want to.
Oh, did you want to do that?
Oh. I know we wish we were there with you in person, Don, to be able to give you a real kata. But Lama Yeshe House, thanks you so much for the generous teachings and your time and wonderful enthusiasm. I think it's been so precious for all of our members. So thank you. We hope you return very soon.
Good, good. Well, I'll do my best. Thank you so much for the invitation to return. And like I said previously, I mean, I really do hope this goes away somewhat quickly so we can go back to in-person events. But if it has to be online, that's what it'll be. So, all right, let's do a few dedication prayers then to make sure that we certainly take advantage of what we've accumulated, the merit and so on, and that we are doing everything we can to benefit others through the force of what we've done here over this weekend. I'd like to go ahead and do a short mandala offering. This isn't intended for me or anything. It's nice to think about our gurus. I can only present what I've presented and teach what I've taught through the kindness of my gurus. So as I recite this and as you recite it, you can think about those teachers in your life, those gurus and guides who are very instrumental in your spiritual development, and present this vast pure offering, thinking of the entire phenomenal world transformed into a beautiful Buddha paradise, and making that vast pure offering so you can continue to receive the blessings and guidance of your gurus. And we'll recite the little prayer that comes after this that is making a strong intention for the gurus to remain and to continue to benefit us and others. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. May my venerable Lamas' lives be firm, their white divine actions spread in the 10 directions. May the torch of the teachings of Losang always remain, dispelling the darkness of all beings in the three realms. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then the two dedication prayers we've done in other sessions. Let's recite those with the strong thoughts of dedicating this positive potential we've created for the benefit of all through dedicating for our own enlightenment. And then secondly, to recall bodhicitta. And as I've been pointing out, the strong aspiration that this grow and develop in the hearts of all beings, especially the leaders of the world at this time. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. And we've already made some aspirations for the long lives of our gurus, but let's say these two prayers for His Holiness and Lama Zopa Rinpoche. But as I always say, make this an aspiration that includes all other spiritual guides from whatever traditions. If they are intent upon helping others to find happiness, to practice a path of morality and kindness and compassion, may these guides continue to be in this world and others continue to benefit from them. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then lastly, as usual, dedicate for anyone you're holding in your heart. We all are moved by the suffering in the world these days, and there is no shortage of people to think about and to pray for. But those who we have specifically thoughts about, such as dear ones who are experiencing obstacles, who are dealing with illness, who are dying or who have died, or anyone else who's in a situation where we've heard about and are moved by that, such as the people affected by the forest fires in California and in Colorado, here in New Mexico, other parts of the world, people affected by other weather disasters, people affected by coronavirus, whatever it is. Again, those beings who we might more want to channel this energy towards. Send this positive energy out to these beings that you're holding in your heart. With your thoughts of loving kindness and compassion, wish for them to be free of all the suffering they're experiencing and to have all the conditions that will lead them to perfect peace and happiness. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through what we've done here this weekend, and all our efforts for that matter. So wonderful. Thank you all so much again. I enjoyed this greatly, and I really appreciate the opportunity and all of your kindness. So I will look forward to connecting with you all again sometime. And perhaps I'll see you, Heather, here in Santa Fe,
Love
since
it.
you'll be here for a
Yeah.
little while. So that would be great. So
Yeah.
anyway, blessings to you all. And please do stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you, Dawn.
Hey, Dawn.
You're
Have a
very
great
welcome. Thank you.